I should have let the man die. That thought haunts me now. An intrusive whisper in the back of my mind, gnawing at the edges of my conscience. If I had let nature take its course, if I had simply failed, none of this would have happened. He would have died like he was supposed to, and I wouldn't be sitting here trapped in a government research lab that smells of antiseptic and something worse. Something wrong. My name is Dr. Daniel Harlow, and I was part of a project that promised to cure disease. Instead, we made something far worse. I was never supposed to be this kind of scientist. Not the type that works in the shadows, buried in a classified underground facility where morality is nothing more than a variable to be controlled. I started in academia, Harvard Medical School, top of my class. I was the type of person who believed in science as a force for good, who believed that every disease had a cure if only we were smart enough, fast enough, bold enough to find it. That belief got me recruited into Project Elysium. It began as a whispered offer after a conference in Geneva. A man in a tailored suit, a government recruiter though he never gave his name, told me they were working on something revolutionary. Something that would make chemotherapy, antibiotics, even organ transplants obsolete. True cellular regeneration, he had called it. A cure for all disease. I was skeptical, of course. Every scientist with half a brain knew that biological perfection was a myth. There was always a cost, but I was young, ambitious, and arrogant enough to think I could be part of something world-changing. And so, I signed the contract. The next thing I knew, I was flown out to Site Theta, a research facility so deep underground that you could feel the weight of the earth pressing down on you. There were no windows, no connection to the outside world. Only corridors of sterile white light and locked doors that required biometric scans just to take a piss. Inside, some of the brightest minds in medicine, genetics, and nanotechnology were gathered, all working toward one singular goal: the creation of the Elysium Serum. At its core, the serum was elegant. We weren't just fighting disease, we were rewriting the body's code. Instead of relying on the immune system, our serum introduced microscopic self-replicating nanites that could repair damaged cells at an atomic level. Cancer? Gone. Heart disease? Reversed. Neural degeneration? A thing of the past. It was supposed to be a miracle. It wasn't. The first human trial was a man named Jameson Cole, 46 years old, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He had maybe 2 months left to live, his body already ravaged by the disease. When they wheeled him into the observation chamber, he looked like a walking corpse, skin pale and sagging, eyes sunken, his breathing shallow. We administered the serum at exactly 10:23 a.m. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. His vitals remained steady, and I could see the skepticism in the other researchers' eyes. But then, his heart rate spiked. His body convulsed violently, and I was seconds away from calling the test a failure when something impossible happened. Jameson stopped shaking. His vitals stabilized, and then, right in front of us, his body began to heal. Tumorous tissue broke down and was reabsorbed. His jaundiced skin faded back to a healthy tone. His hair, which had been thinning from the chemotherapy, started growing back thicker. Within an hour, he was sitting up in bed, looking around in confusion, completely cured. For the first time in my life, I witnessed a true medical miracle. By the end of the day, Jameson was walking without assistance. By the end of the week, his muscle mass had doubled. He was stronger, faster, sharper. His reflexes were off the charts. He wasn't just healthy, he was optimized. I should have been overjoyed, and I was. For a while, until Jameson stopped sleeping. At first, he claimed he didn't need to anymore. He said he felt perfectly fine, more alert than he'd ever been. But the change wasn't just physical. His personality started to shift. He became detached. He would stare at us for long periods without blinking. His movements became unnaturally smooth, his reactions too precise, like he was thinking ahead of everyone else in the room. Then, one night, he attacked a nurse. We found her in the hallway outside his room, unconscious, her arm twisted at an impossible angle. The security footage showed Jameson standing over her, his face blank, emotionless. When the guards arrived, he didn't resist. He simply turned to the camera, as if he knew we were watching, and said in a voice that didn't sound like his own, "I see it now. The cure isn't for them, it's for us." I don't know what he meant by us, but I know I wasn't part of it. Something was changing. After the incident, Jameson was transferred to a restricted wing. I wasn't allowed access anymore, but I heard whispers from the security team. They said he wasn't human anymore, that he moved differently, that he could anticipate what people were going to do before they did it. And then there were the others. More test subjects followed. Each one healed faster, became stronger, changed. Some adapted quicker than others. Some didn't survive the process. Their bodies rejected the serum in horrific ways, bones snapping and reforming at unnatural angles, flesh twisting as the nanites tried to fix them in ways we couldn't predict. I started digging through the classified research logs, and that's when I found something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't the first version of the serum. It wasn't even the 10th. Project Elysium had been running for years before I ever set foot in that lab. There were other test groups before ours, other failures that had been covered up, their records buried deep within government files. And all of them ended the same way. The infected didn't just heal, they evolved. And once they did, they no longer cared about the people who had created them. That was when I realized the truth. We weren't curing disease, we were creating something beyond human. And whatever it was waking up. The first time I saw Jameson after his transfer, I knew he wasn't human anymore. It was nearly a week after he had attacked the nurse. Security had locked him away in the lower levels of Site Theta, behind reinforced steel doors that required biometric clearance I no longer had. But I was never one to follow rules when the stakes were this high. I pulled a few favors, accessed a restricted surveillance feed, and watched him through the cameras. Jameson sat perfectly still in his isolation cell, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his posture impossibly straight. He didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there, staring at the two-way mirror as if he could see through it. And then, without warning, he turned his head toward the camera. My stomach clenched. He shouldn't have known he was being watched. He had no monitors in his room, no visible way of detecting the hidden cameras. But he knew, and he was smiling. Not a normal smile, not even a smirk. It was an imitation of one, like something that had learned how to smile by watching other people do it. I shut the feed off, and that was the moment I knew. The serum hadn't saved him. It had replaced him. I confronted Dr. Lillian Monroe the next day, one of the lead researchers on Project Elysium, and one of the only people I still trusted. She was sitting in the break room, staring at her untouched cup of coffee, dark circles under her eyes. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "We need to shut this down," I said, dropping a classified file onto the table in front of her. She barely reacted. "You don't think I know that?" I exhaled sharply, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're hiding the early test results, the failures. This isn't about curing disease anymore. The nanites are doing something else. They're changing them." Lillian looked up at me then, her expression unreadable. "You don't get it, do you?" she whispered. "Get what?" She pushed the file back toward me, her hands shaking. "We're too late." I stared at her, my pulse hammering in my ears. "What do you mean, too late?" She swallowed hard and leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're not failing, Daniel. This isn't a mistake. This is what they were designed to do." The words hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the facility's emergency alarm started blaring. And I knew something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. The hallways were chaos. Red warning lights flashed in rhythmic pulses, bathing everything in a blood-colored glow. Scientists and personnel ran in every direction, shouting orders that no one could hear over the blaring sirens. Security teams rushed past, their rifles raised. I grabbed the nearest guard by the arm. "What the hell is happening?" He didn't even hesitate. "Containment breach." My blood turned to ice. I turned to Lillian. "Jameson." She nodded once. "And the others." It wasn't just Jameson anymore. There were over a dozen test subjects in isolation, each one dosed with the Elysium serum, each one supposedly contained. Only now, they weren't. I sprinted toward the restricted wing, Lillian close behind me. My keycard wouldn't get me inside anymore, but it didn't matter. When I reached the doors, they were already wide open. The guards who had been stationed outside lay motionless on the floor, their bodies twisted at unnatural angles. One of them was still alive. Barely. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. I knelt beside him, pressing a hand against his chest. "What happened?" I asked. His eyes rolled toward me, unfocused. His lips trembled as he tried to speak. Then, in a voice so faint I almost didn't hear it, he whispered. A cold shiver crawled down my spine. "Not escaped, not broke out. Let us go." I rose to my feet, my hands trembling, and that's when I heard it. A slow, deliberate sound. Footsteps. Not hurried, not panicked, measured, precise. Lillian grabbed my wrist. "We need to go. Now." But I couldn't move, because stepping into the hallway, walking with eerie calmness over the bodies of the fallen, was Jameson. His eyes locked onto mine, and he smiled. The moment stretched impossibly long. Jameson stood there, watching us, his head tilting slightly as if analyzing us, as if deciding something. Then, with unnatural fluidity, he took a step forward. Lillian pulled at my arm again, harder this time. "Daniel, move." It snapped me out of my trance. I stumbled backward, and we ran. Behind us, I heard the sound of boots against tile. Other security teams arriving, their weapons drawn. "Freeze!" one of the guards shouted. "Get on the ground." Jameson stopped. For a brief moment, I hoped, that maybe, just maybe, they could contain him. Then he moved. Not like a man, not like anything I'd ever seen. 1 second he was standing still. The next, he was inside their ranks. Bones snapped, bodies crumpled. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the enclosed space, but it didn't matter. Jameson wasn't dodging bullets. He was anticipating them, moving before they were even fired. One of the guards turned and tried to run. Jameson grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the ground with one hand. The man struggled, gasping, kicking wildly, until Jameson whispered something in his ear, and the guard just stopped. His body went limp. And then, without warning, he stood up again. His movements slow, mechanical. He turned toward the remaining guards and attacked them. My stomach twisted in horror. Jameson wasn't just killing them. He was changing them. I grabbed Lillian's arm. "We need to get to the control room. We have to shut down the lab." She didn't argue. We ran. We reached the control room just as the automated lockdown sequence initiated. Thick steel doors slammed shut behind us, cutting us off from the rest of the facility. I rushed to the monitors, flipping through security feeds. The infected were spreading. The test subjects had escaped containment. Scientists, guards, anyone they touched either died screaming or stood back up again. Lillian was already at the terminal, typing frantically. "I can still override the security protocol," she said. "But if we do this, we're sealing everyone inside. No one gets out." I swallowed hard. It wasn't a choice. Not anymore. "Do it." She entered the final command. The facility went dark. Every door in Site Theta sealed shut. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a whisper, a voice coming through the facility's intercom system. Soft, calm. "Do you really think that will stop us?" My blood turned to ice. I turned to Lillian. She was staring at the monitor, at the camera feed showing the inside of the control room, where Jameson was standing, smiling. And then the screen went black. The screen went black. For a moment, neither Lillian nor I moved. The only sound was the hum of the emergency power running through the control room. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Jameson was inside this room, but that was impossible. The control room was locked down. The security doors had sealed automatically. We had sealed them ourselves. And yet, when I turned around, my breath caught in my throat. Jameson stood by the far wall, perfectly still, watching us. His body cast no shadow in the dim emergency lighting. His eyes weren't right. They weren't just human eyes anymore. They were too dark, too deep, like twin voids that seemed to pull in the light around them. A slow smile spread across his face. He had no reason to rush, no reason to chase, because Jameson wasn't just infected, he was the infection, and we had never been in control. I moved before I could think, grabbing Lillian's wrist and yanking her toward the emergency exit panel. "We have to move, now!" She hesitated for half a second, staring at Jameson, then snapped into action, slamming her ID badge against the emergency override. A countdown began. 10 seconds before the failsafe door would unseal. Jameson took a slow step forward. I braced myself, expecting him to lunge, to sprint, to attack. But he didn't. He just watched. 8 seconds. 7. A low, distorted voice filled the room, not from his mouth, but from the intercom system itself. "Where do you think you're going?" 5 seconds. I glanced at the security monitors, hoping, praying that the rest of the facility had held. But the cameras only showed death. The infected were everywhere. Some still wore lab coats, some wore security uniforms. Others were barely recognizable, their bodies twisted, hollowed out by whatever was growing inside them. 3 seconds. A metallic click. The emergency exit released. We bolted. We expected chaos, screaming, running. But the hallways were silent. No bodies. No blood. Just the faint, rhythmic hum of the emergency generators and the red pulse of the warning lights overhead. Lillian was breathing hard. "We're not getting out of here, are we?" I ignored the question and kept moving. There was still one last option, the incineration chamber. It was built as a last resort, a way to sterilize contaminated equipment before it left the facility. But if we could reroute the power and overload the thermal systems, we could burn the infection out, all of it, including ourselves. We reached the control panel for the incineration chamber, but the screens were already flickering, lines of corrupted code scrolling across them, rewriting themselves in real time. The infection was already here. And then, a voice. Jameson's voice. But not just him. Others layered on top of each other. The voices of the scientists, the guards, the patients, all of them speaking at once. "You don't understand what we are." Lillian recoiled, her hands trembling as she typed furiously, trying to override the corrupted controls. We were dying, and now we are not. We were weak, and now we are strong. I grabbed a fire axe from the emergency cabinet and swung it at the terminal, sparks flying as the screen shattered. The voices didn't stop. "You thought you could control us, that we were a disease to be cured." I turned to Lillian, my heart hammering. "We need to trigger the incineration manually." Her face was pale. She nodded once. "But we are not the disease," the voices whispered. "You are." And then the screaming started. They were already inside us. Lillian collapsed, clutching her head. Her skin was pale, a thin layer of sweat forming over her forehead. Something moved beneath the surface of her skin, shifting like liquid. "No, no," I whispered, backing away. She looked up at me, eyes wide, terrified. "Daniel," I knew what I had to do. My grip tightened on the axe, but before I could raise it, Lillian did something I didn't expect. She smiled. Not a normal smile, not hers. And she whispered, "Run." Then she turned and slammed her hand against the override panel. The incineration sequence engaged. The doors to the chamber began to seal, and Lillian stepped inside. I ran forward, trying to stop it, but she just shook her head, her eyes glistening with something human. "I won't be like them." The doors sealed shut, and then through the glass, I saw her lips form one final word: burn. Flames erupted inside the chamber. The last thing I saw was her silhouette standing tall, unmoving, before the fire consumed her. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the screaming stopped. I staggered backward, choking on the thick scent of burning flesh, my entire body shaking. The incineration chamber had done its job. Lillian was gone. The lab was quiet. For the first time since the outbreak began, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, it was over. Then I heard it. A single whisper, right behind me. "Did you really think fire would stop us?" I turned and saw my own reflection in the observation glass. But it wasn't me. My reflection smiled and whispered, "We're already inside you." Darkness swam at the edges of my vision. A sharp pain bloomed in my skull, spreading down my spine like liquid fire. The last thing I remembered was my knees hitting the floor. And then, nothing. I woke up somewhere else, not in the lab, not in the incineration chamber. I was in a hospital, a clean, white room. Bright lights overhead, machines beeping steadily beside me. My hands trembled as I lifted them, examining my arms, my skin. No burns, no wounds, no infection. A doctor entered the room, clipboard in hand, smiling warmly. "Dr. Carter," she said, "you've been unconscious for 3 days. You're lucky to be alive." I opened my mouth to speak, but my throat was dry. The doctor poured me a glass of water, her movements calm, reassuring. "You were found outside the facility?" She continued. "Site Theta went into full lockdown. It was destroyed. We lost so many." I swallowed, my voice hoarse. "How did I get out?" She hesitated. Then slowly, she slid a mirror onto my bedside table, and for the first time I saw my own reflection. My eyes, they were too dark, too deep, and I knew. I had never escaped. The infection had. If you made it this far, you're a true horror fan. What would you do if you realized you were the infection all along? Let me know in the comments below. And if you love terrifying stories like this, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new nightmare. More horrors are coming, and trust me, you won't want to face them alone. Until next time, stay safe if you can.